What's good, everybody? Welcome to the Big Nate Review. It's your boy Big Nate, and today we have a very interesting story to talk about. Today we are talking about the recent killing of the CEO of United Healthcare, but I also want to just use this event, which is already just like crazy in itself, but I wanted to interpret it in terms of the philosophy of Karl Marx and essentially his critiques of capitalism and this idea of the power and class struggles between what he refers to as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So we're going to get into all that good stuff, but first I want to talk about the actual event itself, which took place on December 4th, 2024. And what happened was Brian Thompson, who is the CEO of United Healthcare, which is one of the biggest companies, not only in healthcare, it's the biggest company in healthcare, but it's also one of the biggest companies in the entire world. So he is the CEO, or at least of the subsidiary, there's United Healthcare and then which is part of United Healthcare groups. We're going to talk about them more or less interchangeably. So essentially what happened was Brian Thompson was coming out of an investor meeting, which was, as I understand it, literally him essentially just flexing the profit, the billions of dollars of profit that United Healthcare obtained through his tenure. So I don't know if that's like poetic justice here, or if it just happened to be convenient that he came out of, and he was in a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. I had to throw on the New York shirt, had to represent. But he comes out, and basically the man was standing there. And he'd been waiting for several minutes. He's masked up, which led authorities to immediately believe this was a hit. And there's plenty of motive, which we'll talk about. But essentially, Brian Thompson comes out, and he doesn't even face the guy. I obviously can't show the footage, but it's on Wikipedia. But the dude, he has a silenced 9mm, and he just blicks him down, and then he just walks off the screen. So it was cold, calculated, and already people were speculating that this was probably a hit related to one of any of the millions, hundreds of millions of people that have been fucked over by United Healthcare, which again we'll talk about. But so if that wasn't clear enough, though, what happened was, and this is what I think makes this an especially political message, was on the bullet shell casings there were the words written: deny, defend, depose. And I actually had to look up what depose meant, and it means to suddenly and forcefully remove someone out of office, which, however we feel about this, I will say that is quite badass. So deny, defend, depose. And that's actually based off of a popular phrase in the insurance industry, which is delay, deny, defend, which is insane. That's their catchphrase for not paying patients out. Delay, just put as many administrative fucking obstacles as you can, be as hard to contact as possible, and just generally make it as difficult and painstaking and just nails on chalkboard trying to get the services that they are actually entitled to, which is just crazy fucked up. But I think it makes the writing on the shell cases, it makes that political message all the more impactful. But so I want to talk a second about, because when you hear someone just getting gunned down in the streets, obviously you just think that's a horrible thing, morally reprehensible thing to do, just gun someone down. But when we get into the history of who Brian Thompson was and what he, especially the company and corporation that he represented, you begin to be a little less sympathetic. So Brian Thompson was the CEO of United Healthcare, which was the major subsidiary of the larger company United Healthcare Groups, and they last year alone made over $370 billion. And over the course of Brian Thompson's tenure, their revenue has increased by $80 billion, which, when you consider their total that is no small amount. And just the idea too, I know people bring this up often, but the difference between $1 million and $1 billion is just, is truly incomprehensible to try and wrap your head around. The example that I always come to is the idea that if you were to wait for 1 million seconds, that ends up being about 11 and a half days. If you were going to wait for 1 billion seconds, that is nearly 32 years. So the difference between 1 million and 1 billion is just insane. And under Brian Thompson's tenure, United Healthcare Group increased by $80 billion, which is insane. And part of the way that they're able to make some money is basically just horribly unethical business practices. So this whole company has an extremely long history of insider trading, which is basically so Brian Thompson owned over $20 million of shares, just him alone, in the parent company. And insider trading is basically just when you buy and sell your shares according to confidential information. In fact, Brian Thompson actually did this when he knew the Department of Justice was investigating. There was a lawsuit against them, but before it was released to the public, he sold all his shares, after which, once the announcement came out, obviously the stock tanked. So that would be an example of insider trading. They also just overbill their customers like as much as they possibly can. They do their best to not give out payouts at all. They manipulate customer rates. Like when I was going through the controversies and lawsuits of this company, it is way too long. Like a Wikipedia page of lawsuits should not be that damn long. So it's really just the most like reprehensible shit you can do. And like there's some really great examples of this. So for one, this one I think is particularly insidious. They bought a policy research center. So along with just on the order of tens, hundreds of millions, just basically just outright defrauding their customers and overcharging, not giving payments, denying treatments, this, that, and the other. Just on top of that general shittiness, they've also done things like buy policy research centers, and the studies produced by these research centers are cited and referenced and used as justification to pass certain forms of legislation. Like these studies are cited in like congressional hearings and trying to get bills and legislation passed. And they have a history of literally taking the research, going in and just completely, if not like just outright fabricating the data, completely spinning it, altering it just to make themselves look good. They have complete control over like what's supposed to be a nonpartisan, objective production of research, which is supposed to give actual informed decisions to passing like what is legislation which will affect millions of people. And speaking of legislation, they also have dedicated millions upon millions and millions of dollars to supporting political candidates or lobbyist group, basically so that they can, and this is, okay, start thinking about the Marx stuff, right? Because you have these enormous $100 billion corporations essentially funding political campaigns. So we're gonna get to all that, but just right now we're just talking about the general shittiness of that. And so they essentially have people with political power in their pockets. And this is like, to me, I mean, there's so many cases, and we're gonna talk about some like that have come from social media of people's like actual stories. But this one I think is just the icing on the unethical cake. Once the Affordable Care Act was passed, top executives from this company also met with other insurers. They met monthly over the course of like a year, literally to talk about how they can limit the effect of giving the Affordable Care Act its power. Like how can they limit people who are in need of healthcare, them maximizing their full benefits. So just really truly shitty stuff. They have lawsuits from like dozens and dozens of companies or organizations, but some notable ones are the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commissions, the IRS, multiple lawsuits by the Department of Justice. Again, we're going to start thinking about the Marx stuff here. Like you have some of the top government institutions trying to put a stop to this, and they cannot. So we're gonna circle back to that. But just in general, they have a very, very long list of lawsuits. One of those lawsuits was for a fucking RICO, which is essentially, that's when like you get like a mob boss, like the mafia, that's like what a RICO, it's like organized crime. And like Young Thug and YSL right now, that like if anybody knows what's going on there, that whole trial was like, that was a RICO. It is literally just organized crime, just at the scale of business. And one of the judges in one of these like, dozens and dozens of lawsuits basically was a former cancer survivor. And he was so just appalled and called them immoral and barbaric that he recused himself from the case because he would not be able to judge their heinousness impartially. So he had to excuse himself from the case entirely, and they had to get a new judge. They also have over 900,000 accusations of violating the Unfair Insurance Practices Act. So generally they have a very long, illustrious career of malpractice and unethicalness and just generally being a very shitty company. So in light of all this event like that just took place, people have been coming to social media talking about their stories with United Healthcare, and there were just a couple very egregious instances that I just feel like I have to bring up just to really paint the picture of what this looks like on the ground, because I'm talking about this very high level, but what this means is that tens, hundreds of millions of American citizens are not getting the proper healthcare that they need and deserve, and some of these are just downright evil. So here I have a couple examples that I pulled up. So this is a letter from a doctor who essentially was treating a child for chemotherapy, and they said that the nausea medicine was not medically necessary, and so they denied the claim for giving this child going through chemotherapy nausea medicine because it was non-necessary. So this is what he said. Apparently, you have decided that a child receiving chemotherapy has no reason to be nauseated. Obviously, you would know better about the side of effects of chemotherapy than me, my peers, and the entire scientific community, going all the way back to Dr. Sidney Farber. I suppose my alternative to Zofran and Scopolamine is to let my patient know that the nausea is all in his head. However, I don't imagine you would cover any psychological consultation either. So just like truly the worst of the worst. Like there's so many examples just like on Reddit and social media in general. Like there was one case where this child with cerebral palsy was just trying to get like a wheelchair, and they said it was non-necessary, and they could have gone with like a simpler version. And basically just this wheelchair for a child with cerebral palsy. How much can a wheelchair cost? Like it cannot. We're talking about a multi-$100 billion industry, and they cannot afford to give a fucking kid with cerebral palsy a goddamn wheelchair. And they're doing like all these people are coming out with stories like denying cancer treatment, denying children inhalers as also being non-necessary. A recent thing that they were trying to pass was like deeming emergency room visits. They got to decide whether it was medically necessary or not, and that would decide whether they got a payout and stuff. They also have like another recent controversy was they had an AI sort of claims adjuster, which had a horrible accuracy rate. This is essentially a corporation which is trying to maximize profit, but the way in which it does so is by increasing the suffering and just giving out as little as possible to these people who are already paying them monthly hundreds of dollars, and denying them treatments, denying them pain medication they need to survive, inhalers, wheelchairs, you name it. But meanwhile, Brian Thompson, under whose policies many of these situations arose from, he is in the meantime making tens of millions of dollars every single year. Like he is essentially, or at least the company, but we'll just say Brian Thompson for the sake of argument here, is essentially denying a child chemotherapy, nausea medicine, or a child with cerebral palsy their wheelchair so that he can just make that many more millions of dollars. And this now I think we can start talking more about the Marxist critiques of capitalism, and specifically Marx and also Engels' idea of the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie is generally, just like, this is a very rough distinction here, but the bourgeoisie are essentially the people who own the means of production. And at the very highest level, these are the billionaires. These are people like Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, what's his name, Jeff Bezos. These are people who own tremendous amounts of, like I said, the means of production, and have at their disposal enormous amounts of wage labor. And that's provided by the proletariat, who has no means of production of their own and are forced, in order to survive, to sell their own labor. So, and what I thought was really interesting about, because I just started reading at least excerpts of the Communist Manifesto, and what I thought was really interesting was this idea that we see in modern day between, like the billionaires owning the top, like the three. I saw something that Bernie Sanders said, like 3 people in the United States own more than 50%. Like 3 people essentially have more money than it's like got to be like 150, 175, 200 million people in the United States alone. So the wealth inequality is insane.
Here is the startling reality that almost nobody talks about. You talk about why people are angry out there. All right? They have a reason to be angry. There has been a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. 3 people, if you can believe this, own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. What do you think about that? Is that what America's supposed to be?
This idea goes back all the way to Marx says the history of human society is the history of class struggle. But what I was going to say is, like, back in medieval times with like nobility and feudal lords, there's a quote in the book that says, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, in a word, the oppressor and the oppressed. And again, what we see today is just another extension of what has historically been going on since society has essentially existed. And today it takes a modern form. Like, what comes to mind for me are those pictures you see of, to just make it overwhelmingly clear the divide, the wealth inequality, where it's like you'll see a picture, it's like an aerial view of a city, and it's like it's oftentimes separated by a literal wall, and on the one side there's just affluent and there's these mansions, these huge houses, and to the right it's just shanty houses and everything's wrecked, and it's essentially like a ghetto. And what comes to mind to me also is like the civil rights movement, the idea of ghettos there, where you have essentially black people fresh out of slavery are relegated to these areas which are poor, have no infrastructure. It's essentially like the physical playing out, the physical representation of the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And what Marx says, which is just, I think, facts, it's just so true, especially when you think about like modern day capitalism, is the bourgeoisie essentially view the proletariat as nothing but labor. And there's a great quote. It's like the priest, the poet, the man of science, all of them have been reduced to essentially commodities, to wage laborers. And it's through this view of them that they essentially become, that there is at least the means for exploitation. So they get viewed as like, from the tippity top at the, the highest social economic ladder, they just view like, the plebeians below as appendages to a machine. That's what Marx and Engels write, appendages to a machine. And as such, because they're so dehumanized and don't give a fuck basically about these people's lives, they get treated in a way, they get treated as a commodity, right? Just like you would machinery. What do you try and do? You try and do everything you can to drive production down and like the cost of production down and to increase the means of profit. And because the proletariat don't have any means of production of their own, they are forced to work to earn a living, right? You have to work to earn your daily bread. And essentially the bourgeoisie exploit that fact, and especially because they're viewed as nothing but parts in the machine where you have to get that cost as low as possible, they pay, this is what he writes in the Communist Manifesto, which I think is just fact. They pay the proletariat the bare minimum that they need to survive. And again, that's what we mean by people living paycheck to paycheck. And again, what's so brilliant, this was written in the late 1800s. And it just is so relevant today because they write that no sooner is the wage laborer essentially exploited and paid their wage than they are set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie. The second you get your check, you got to pay rent, you got to pay for groceries, you got to pay electricity, you got to pay car insurance, you got to pay phone bill, just the list of things goes on, and you're paying ultimately to these big corporations all the peanuts that you earn for your wage compared to their hundreds of millions of billions of dollars. All that little tiny peanuts you get, you just give it right back to them, right? And it's just this cycle where essentially it's the saying, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. It's this endless cycle where the proletariat gets more and more exploited and the bourgeoisie capitalize more and more on that. And like another way of that I thought was just like a very sobering perspective was this idea, and he's writing in the late 1800s, and even then he's talking about like modern technology, modern industry has reached a point that was previously incomprehensible. And that again, that's when Marx was writing. So if you could see from what like the amount of production and consumerism and just like globalization, technology, industry that's taken place since Marx, it's just an unfathomable amount of production. And yet, as Marx writes, the modern laborer, instead of growing with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper into his class. Like at this point, we have like hundreds of billions, if not $1 trillion GDP economies, and yet the proletariat sees none of that. Instead, right now, the federal minimum wage is like whatever, $8 an hour, and the proletariat sees none of it. Again, as Marx says, they sink deeper and deeper into their class, which is essentially to say the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
The bottom line is that what's happened is over the last 50 years, as workers have become more productive, producing more, they have not benefited from it. Almost all of that increase in wealth has gone to the people on top.
And tying it back to this whole killing of Brian Thompson, this recent event that took place, I think to me it's really like a representation of that class struggle. It's a result of the frustration, the rage, the anger of being oppressed. And this is an act of political revolt against the oppressor. And I do think this is a really interesting moral question as to whether what this man did was, morally justified. Because on the one hand, it needs to be said, Brian Thompson was a human being, right? He had a wife, he had 2 kids, he was somebody's brother, he was somebody's child. And even though he may have had some shitty and just frankly evil policies, again, he still fundamentally was a human being. And that's its own question, right? Whether like his evils outweigh justify getting murdered by somebody. But also the sentiment right now is that we should never resort to political violence to get our message across. But I think what Marx would say in response to this is there really is no alternative to violence, because the very nature of the bourgeoisie is that they control everything. How many lawsuits from the actual governmental Department of Justice were denied or blocked or won in favor of United Healthcare because they just they wield so much power. We talked about how they own the scientific institutions which publish the research. We've talked about how they have donated tens of millions of dollars to politicians. So they own the politicians, they own the science, they own, it's not crazy to think that there might be some sort of lobbying or some sort of judicial influence. And I think that's also reflected in the fact that I think there's hundreds of cases which they were clearly wrong, and because of whatever their power, their money, they are able to continually elude the legal system, which is supposed to be there to penalize them. So if we can't rely on our politicians, or if we can't rely on science, our judicial system, right? If everything is essentially infected by the bourgeoisie power structure, there really is no alternative besides, physical violence, political violence. And it's just the idea that if you play by the bourgeoisie game, you are always going to lose. And I think, all thing being said, I think this was probably one of the strongest political messages. I think this is what, beyond the lawsuits, beyond all that, I think this act is going to be something that actually gives healthcare CEOs pause and maybe makes them think about their policy changes. And again, just an example of this recently, which is also there's two levels of insanity to this. Like, the first one is that it's a separate company, but Anthem Healthcare was recently announced that they were going to limit the amount of anesthesia provided during a surgery. They were going to put a cap on how much anesthesia you could have, which is just that's peak Marxist capitalism critique right there. That's some dystopian shit. And again, just so they can make a little more pennies so that their CEO can make, all the more billions of dollars. But it was announced, and they did get a lot of backlash in general from this, but it was very recently after the killing of Brian Thompson that they actually rolled that back. So whether that had an influence on that, I do think this whole event that took place is going to be probably the thing that makes CEOs of these huge corporations think twice. That's going to be the first thing to make them think twice in a long time. And so I just want to kind of end this video here with a quote from Karl Marx, which was the end of the first chapter, which is that ultimately the bourgeoisie end up producing their own gravediggers. And this is that played out to a T. So anyway, let me know what you guys think about this whole event that took place. The Brian Thompson guy, whether, your thoughts on United Healthcare in general, the whole thing, what you think about Marxism and his critiques on capitalism and modern industry and everything like that. And just any thoughts that you have at all, let Big Nate know in the comments. So thanks for tuning in to the Big Nate Review. Follow me on Instagram at Big Nate's Book Reviews. And thank you for watching the Big Nate Review.